Thank you for joining me today on the Pollination Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing California almond pollination and some tips if you're looking to step into this lucrative industry. Did you know that almonds are wholly reliant on bees for pollination? Without these hardworking pollinators, there would be no almonds. The almond bloom in California occurs between late February and early March. During this period, bees become the vital link in transferring pollen from one almond tree to another. This process is critical for the fertilization of the almond trees, leading to the nuts we all enjoy. But why almonds? Well, almonds are a superfood packed with nutrients and health benefits, making them a staple in diets worldwide. The importance of almond crops extends beyond nutrition. They are a significant economic crop, especially in regions like California, which is responsible for about 80% of the global almond supply. Months before the almond trees bloom, beekeepers like myself are already deep in preparation. Ensuring the health of our bee colonies is paramount. We carefully monitor the health of each hive, checking for diseases, ensuring the queen bee is robust and active, and that the hive is well populated and strong. Nutrition plays a key role here. We often supplement the bees' diet with special feeds to enhance their strength and endurance for the upcoming pollination task. Then comes the significant and somewhat daunting task of transporting the bees to the almond orchards. Imagine thousands of hives, each buzzing with activity, being moved under the cover of night to these blooming fields. It's a logistical balancing act, where every step is meticulously planned to ensure the safety and minimal stress for these vital pollinators. I want to start with the importance of pollinating the almond trees. From a business perspective, from a beekeeper that goes to almonds every single year, a good half of our budget, if not more, comes from sending our hives to California to pollinate the almond trees. It's basically our make or break type scenario for the entire year, not only because almond pollination pays significantly more than any other type of pollination, but also, at least in my experience, my hives come back as good or better than the ones that I leave behind to micromanage. What that usually means in a practical sense is that I get half of my annual operating budget met at the beginning of the year, and more or less all of the hives that I send to California, when they return, I can typically double or triple those hives to make up for the losses that I had the previous year. This is always the goal. It doesn't always happen. But that sets me up for a successful year. If we don't have a good year in California, which is usually because my hives weren't strong enough to go, or I just don't physically have enough hives, or maybe someone that was pairing on one of my trucks with me couldn't come up with enough hives, then I'm basically struggling right out of the gate of the new year, both financially and trying to get my hive numbers back up. So to say it is a stressful time of the year is a massive understatement. At least for me, at this stage in our business, this is the most stressful time of the year. It's not uncommon for us to work all day grading hives and move hives all or most of the night. I know last year we were up for at least 3 days straight and 3 nights straight by the time we got the hives shipped out. Almond pollination is something that I wish I had had someone really sit down and explain the kind of inner workings and the do's and don'ts of the entire process when I was just starting out. I've worked for other commercial beekeepers and we sent lots of semis to almond pollination, but I didn't have my hand in the entire process like I do now. So I want to share some of that knowledge that I've gained, and a lot of that's been pretty hard-won knowledge. First of all, just understand that this is my opinion and my personal perspective on how to run a successful apiary here in Florida. If you're in a different state, what I'm saying may not be practical for you, but if you're certainly around me, I think this could be pretty useful information. If you're just starting out running honeybees for a business, you probably don't have many hives. It's very unlikely you can afford the entire price of a semi. And it's going to be more difficult for you to secure a pollination contract through an almond broker, or to go directly to the farmers, bypassing the almond broker and secure the contract yourself. I'm not saying it's impossible, but in my opinion, that's not very practical. What is practical is that you might have 25 hives, or 50 hives, or 100 hives that are in good shape. And if you're running those numbers of hives, you certainly know it's not a cheap endeavor to do so, so every extra dollar helps. What you should be doing, if you're just dipping your toes into the world of sideline beekeeping, is that you should be looking for larger commercial beekeepers who do hold these pollination contracts and who can afford to pay a semi up front to send to almonds. A lot of commercial beekeepers will at times be short on hives that they're required to fulfill their pollination contracts with. At the time of this recording, I had committed to sending 2 semis to almonds this year. But by the time I got through grading my hives, I found out that I'm short on one of the loads. So what I'm doing right now is going around trying to call the smaller beekeepers who have 50 hives or 100 hives, and I'm asking them to fill in what I'm short on. The benefit to me is that I get to fulfill my pollination contracts, and I'm able to send as many hives as I have. The benefit to the smaller beekeeper is that they will be able to send those smaller numbers of hives with little to no financial investment, and also very little of the mental stress that comes with trying to vie for these contracts and negotiate prices between all the different truck brokers and almond brokers, and trying to manage these smaller beekeepers to make sure they're sending you good hives and not weak hives, and that they deliver them on time to my apiary so we can send them out on the semi. Some of these small beekeepers don't have flatbed trucks with forklifts or bobcats to move the hives. Some of them don't even have full-weight pallets and have their hives on bottom boards. I was in this situation the first year that I sent my hives to almonds. There was another beekeeper who was also looking to fill out their semi that they were short on, and they were kind enough to drive some distance and pick up my beehives from my property with their flatbed truck and their forklift. So just because you don't have all of these expensive pieces of machinery, or if your hives are on bottom boards, that does not mean that you can't go to almonds. In fact, me getting into the almond pollination side of the business is what originally infused my business with enough cash for me to get to the point to where I am now. Had I just been relying on nukes and queens and honey sales, I probably would not be working for myself yet. The best resource that you can use to try and contact some of these larger beekeepers, if you don't know them personally, is to reach out to your local state bee inspector. The state inspectors are a point of contact between the hobby beekeepers, the sideline beekeepers, and the commercial beekeepers. Everybody flows through them. And the state bee inspectors have to come and inspect our hives right before they get shipped off to California. So they are up to date on the numbers that we have, how our hives are doing, or if we need more hives or not. So my advice is if you want to start earning an income with honeybees, you should get into California as soon as possible. There are people who will disagree with that opinion, but that's what worked for me. And the most successful beekeepers that I see, at least in my area, are going to almonds every single year. That's just my advice to beekeepers who are not quite able to work for themselves full-time yet. As far as determining what hives are going to be strong and healthy enough to get to California and pass inspection, you have to grade the hives right before they leave. And ideally as close to shipping as possible so your numbers are the most accurate and the most up-to-date. That's also a bit of a double-edged sword, because opening your hives only a few days prior to shipping will not allow the bees to repropolize the box and the lid well enough, and they can split open on the drive. That can cause your hives to be damaged or even die outright. My advice is to let your hives sit for a solid week if possible without opening the hive or removing the lid before shipping so the bees can seal everything well. Although if I'm being honest, in reality most of us are running through our hives sometimes every minute of every single day, just trying to hope that those small ones will boost up enough to send. So it's definitely a tightrope to walk. There are many different opinions on how to properly grade a beehive. I'll explain the way that I do it. Your best bet to make sure that you're properly grading your hives is to communicate with either your broker or the farmer and ask them how they want you to grade the hives. It's also never a bad thing, because most of the brokers live in California, to just open up some of your hives, take a picture, and text it to them and ask them if that's acceptable. The brokers are extremely busy this time of year, and they're managing a lot of different beekeepers and sometimes tens of thousands of beehives. So make sure you don't ask them a question and expect an immediate response. My opinion is that it's never best to grade optimistically. Don't think about what that hive might be in 2 weeks from now. Look at what it is right now. If you have to project a couple weeks into the future on what the hive might be population-wise, which if I'm being absolutely honest, we all do sometimes, you have to understand that there is a risk that it will fail inspection and you will not be paid for that hive. You will still have to pay the shipping cost for that hive. You will damage your reputation with your broker, and they may not do business with you again next year. Also, it's a good thing to keep in mind most of the major almond brokers personally know each other and that they will talk to each other about the quality of the bees that are coming to them and about the beekeepers who are sending them. If you burn a bridge with one broker, you will affect your relationships with the entire almond brokering community in a negative way as well. Although it's very tempting to get a quick paycheck, you need to think long term and about maintaining a good reputation by sending good bees. This is a delicate balancing act, because the reality is we are all trying to send as many hives as we can just to keep our lights on for another year. Sometimes that requires taking risk. That's the reality of business. The brokers are well aware of this. Some of them have been doing it for decades and have probably dealt with hundreds of different beekeepers. This is something you just have to gauge for yourself. But my advice again is to think long term. The brokers are well aware of this. Some of them have been doing it for decades and have probably dealt with hundreds of different beekeepers. This is something you just have to gauge for yourself. But my advice again is just to think long term. Those brokers also have businesses and families to provide for, just like we do. So the way I grade my hives is that I very lightly smoke them because the bees will run from the smoke and that can affect your grading. I smoke them as little as I possibly can, and sometimes I even wait a few seconds or even a minute for the population to spread back out throughout the hive. After I've smoked the hive, I tilt it forward on the pallet so that you can see underneath the hive and clearly see the frames. I look for a full frame of coverage worth of bees. That means each of the two sides of a frame need to be fully covered with bees from the top bar to the bottom bar. Some people will tell you it only needs to be a 75% coverage, and that is technically true. But it's always best to grade on the conservative side to protect yourself and any other beekeepers that are going with you so that you don't fail the inspection. Another thing to keep in mind is the temperature that you're grading the hives in. Grading during 70-degree weather will give you a much more optimistic count than grading in 50-degree weather. Once I've counted the number of frames that are covered on both sides from top to bottom on my bottom box, I set the hive back on the pallet. Then I open the hive in half and do the exact same thing with the top box. It's always best to grade the hive from the bottom because it will give you a more realistic grade. Most beekeepers know this already because we all know if you open the lid and leave it open for a minute, the bees will rise up to the top and you might look like you have a full box of bees, but in reality, it may barely be a half a box. That's how I do it for my double deep hives. If you're running hive and a halves, which is a deep box and a medium box put together, you will grade the same way for the medium box, except that a medium frame does not count as one frame of bees. I personally like to count 2 medium frames as one frame of bees. I spoke with my broker this year and he said he is okay with 1.5 medium frames to count as one frame of bees. I find that if I just count 2 medium frames as one frame, I'm again grading on the conservative side and I'm less likely to fail inspection. As far as how many frames of bees you need to consider a hive to be good enough to go to almonds depends on your particular pollination contract. The contracts that require a higher frame count of bees will pay more than the contracts that require a lower number of frames. The most common contracts that I come across require a 6-frame minimum population of bees, and you need to average 8 frames of bees across all the hives that you send. Most brokers and inspectors in this type of contract will count any hive that they open that has 5 or fewer frames of bees as a 0 in your average. Typically, about 10 to 20% of your hives will be inspected after they are placed in the almond orchards. The inspectors will randomly select these hives to inspect. I'm sure most of you know how to find an average, but if you don't, let's say you send 400 hives to California and 10% of your hives are inspected. That means 40 of your 400 hives will have their frame counts written down and added together. The inspector will then divide that sum by 40. That will give them your average frame count. In this particular type of contract, that average needs to be at least an 8. If you don't make grade on all the hives, it doesn't mean that you've lost out on being paid on the entire contract. Normally, you will be deducted by the percentage of hives that the inspector determines is below grade. If they find that 10% of your hives are below grade, they will deduct 10% of the contract price from your final paycheck. Of course, maybe the greater ramifications of not making grade are that your broker or farmer may not do business with you again next year. I hope this gives a little bit of insight into what those of us who are going to the almond orchards are going through right now. It's always a very tough time of the year, both physically and mentally, but if it goes well, your year is off to a good start. I have to get back to preparing my own hives now, so thank you all for listening. I'll be with you again in a couple of weeks after my hives have shipped out. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Pollination Podcast. I'm Matthew Walker from Walk in the Woods Apiary. We hope we have answered a few of your beekeeping and pollinator questions. Please share your questions and comments to our Facebook page at the Pollination Podcast.